Eternal Echoes presents In a Lonely Farm, a work by Edward Phillips Oppenheim. Without a doubt, Nicholas Goade was a top-notch detective, but as a traveler on the back roads of Devonshire, with only a map and a compass to guide him, he was a failure. Even his small, fat white dog, Flip, nestled under a couple of blankets after 2 hours of cold, damp, and aimless travel, looked at him reproachfully. Nicholas Goade was enjoying his first long vacation since joining the police force. He was 38 years old, strongly built, with a somewhat ruddy complexion, sharp blue eyes, and an unyielding jawline. A face that might have been a bit heavy was compensated by an easy, charming smile. He had a mass of dark brown hair, too thick for a neat hairstyle. With an exclamation of something close to despair, Goade stopped his wheezing automobile at the top of one of the worst hills a Ford had ever had to climb, even in first gear, and looked around. In every direction, the scenery was the same. Rolling expanses of common land divided by wooded valleys of incredible depth. There were no signs of farmland, no evidence of human labor in the endless acres, and he hadn't passed a single vehicle along the way. No signs, no villages, no shelter of any kind. The only thing in abundance was rain and fog. Gray crowns of clouds hung over the moorlands, shrouding the horizon in an all-encompassing darkness. Then, competing with the fog, came the steady rain, a rain that had seemed beautiful earlier in the afternoon, but had long since turned into nothing but a cold and irritating nuisance. Flip, his nose timidly poking out from under the blanket, sniffed with disgust, and Goade, as he lit his pipe, cursed slowly but fluently under his breath. What a desolate territory it was, with miles of roads without a single signpost and endless stretches without the slightest hint of a farm or a village. The map that Goade had wisely brought along for the journey was of little use here. Somewhere, Goade murmured to himself, the village of Nid should be nearby. The last signpost in this wretched region pointed 6 miles to Nid. Since then, we've traveled at least 12. There hasn't been a single turn to the left or right, and the village of Nid might as well have never existed. His eyes pierced through the encroaching darkness. Through a slight break in the clouds, he thought he could see for miles around. Yet there was no sign of villages or human dwellings. He considered retracing his route, but the thought made him shudder. It was then, as he leaned forward to observe the steam rising from the overheating radiator, that he saw a faint flickering light to his left. He immediately got out of the car, climbed onto the stone wall, and looked intently in the direction where he had seen it. There was no doubt. A light was there. And where there was a light, there must be a house. His eyes could even make out the rough path leading to it. He returned to his seat, engaged the clutch, drove about 40 yards, and then stopped in front of a gate. The path beyond it looked terrible, but so did the road. He opened the gate and drove through, now hunched over the steering wheel, fully alert. It seemed that the only traffic here, if there was any at all, consisted of the occasional farm cart, by now familiar to him, without springs, with holes in its wooden floor, and with large, slowly turning wheels. Nevertheless, he pressed on, skirted the edge of a massive ridge, passed a half-cultivated field, went through another gate, and descended a fantastical spiraling path until, at last, he saw the light directly ahead. He passed through a deserted garden and stopped before a rickety iron gate, which he had to get out to open and then carefully close behind him. Crossing a few yards of sodden, overgrown driveway, he finally reached the door of what might once have been a perfectly tolerable country house, but now, despite the flickering light burning upstairs, seemed one of the most melancholic buildings imaginable. With little expectation of a warm welcome but immense relief at the thought of a roof over his head, Goade stepped out of the car and knocked on the oak door. Inside, he almost immediately heard the sound of a match being struck. The glow of a candle flickered through the unshuttered windows of a room to his left. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and the door opened. Goade found himself facing a woman who held the candle so high above her head that he could barely make out her features. However, there was a certain majesty in her figure, something he noticed even in those first few seconds. "What do you want?" she asked abruptly. Goade, removing his hat, thought the answer was quite obvious. Rain was pouring from every angle of his raincoat-covered body. His face was gaunt from the cold. "I'm a traveler who has lost his way," he explained. "I've been trying for hours to find a village and an inn. Yours is the first human settlement I've come across. Could you offer me shelter for the night?" "Is anyone else with you?" the woman asked. "I'm alone," Goade replied. "Except for my little dog," he added, hearing Flip's hopeful bark. The woman hesitated. "You'd better leave your car in the shed to the left of the house," she said. "Then you can come inside. We'll do what we can for you. It's not much." "I'm very grateful, madam," Goade declared sincerely. He found the shed, which housed only 2 farm carts, in an incredible state of disrepair. After letting Flip out, he returned to the front door, which had been left open. Guided by the sound of crackling logs, he made his way to a massive stone kitchen. Sitting in a high-backed chair by the fire, hands resting on her knees but gazing anxiously toward the door as if expecting him, was another woman. She was also tall, perhaps a little past middle age, yet still striking in presence and refined in features. The woman who had received him was leaning over the fire. Goade looked at both women in astonishment. They were terribly and wonderfully alike. "Ladies, it is very kind of you to offer us shelter," he began. "Flip. Behave yourself, Flip." A large shepherd dog had taken up the space in front of the fire. Flip, without hesitation, ran toward it, barking fiercely. The dog, with an air of mild surprise, stood up and looked down with a curious expression. Flip stretched out by the fire with a satisfied air and closed his eyes. "I must apologize for my little dog," Goade continued. "He's very cold." The shepherd dog stepped back a few feet and sat down on its hind legs, looking calm. Meanwhile, the woman who had opened the door took a cup and saucer from a cupboard, a loaf of bread, and a small portion of bacon, from which she cut a few slices. "Pull your chair up to the fire," she invited. "We have very little to offer, but I will prepare something for you to eat." "You are truly good Samaritans," Goade declared fervently. He sat across from the woman who had yet to speak or take her eyes off the newcomer. The resemblance between the 2 women was astonishing, as was their silence. They wore similar clothes, heavy and bulky, he thought, and each had a brooch on her chest. Their hair, black with slight streaks of gray, was styled in exactly the same manner. Their clothing belonged to another world, as did their way of speaking and their manners, but there was a certain curious distinction between them. "Just out of curiosity," Goade asked, "how far am I from the village of Nid?" "Not far," the woman sitting motionless before him replied. "For anyone who knows the way, it's close enough. Strangers are fools if they trust these roads. Many people get lost trying." "This is a very lonely property," Goade ventured. "We were born here," the woman replied. "Neither my sister nor I have ever felt the desire to travel." The bacon began to sizzle in the pan. Flip opened one eye, licked his muzzle, and sat up. Within minutes, the meal was ready. A high-backed oak chair was placed at the head of the table. There was tea, a plate of bacon and eggs, a large loaf of bread, and a small pot of butter. Goade took his place. "Have you already had dinner?" he asked. "A long time ago," said the woman who had prepared his meal. "Please, help yourself." She sank into the other oak chair, directly opposite her sister. Goade, with Flip at his side, began to eat. Neither of them had had a bite in many hours, and for a moment both happily forgot everything but their food. However, suddenly, as he poured himself a second cup of tea, Goade looked at his hostesses. They had slightly moved their chairs away from the fire and were watching him, not with curiosity, but with a certain unsettling intensity. Then, for the first time, it occurred to him that, although both had spoken to him, neither of them had spoken to each other. "This is delicious," Goade said. "I'm afraid I must seem like a glutton." "Perhaps you haven't eaten in a long time," one of the women said. "Not since this morning," Goade replied. "Are you traveling for pleasure?" "That was my intention," Goade answered with a smile, which received no response. The woman who had welcomed him moved her chair a few inches closer to his. He noticed with some curiosity that immediately after she did so, her sister did the same. "What is your name?" the first woman asked. "Nicholas Goade," he answered. "May I know to whom I owe my gratitude for this hospitality?" "My name is Mathilda Crask," the woman announced. "And mine is Annabelle Crask," the other repeated. "Do you live here alone?" he ventured to ask. "We live here completely alone," Mathilda agreed. "Solitude is a pleasure." Goade was more perplexed than ever. Their speech, slow and carefully enunciated, carried the usual Devonshire intonation and soft vowel pronunciation, but otherwise it was almost excessively precise. Still, the idea that they lived alone in such a desolate place seemed incredible. "Perhaps you have farmland nearby," he insisted. "Do you have workers' houses close by or anything similar?" Mathilda shook her head. "The nearest cottage," she admitted, "is 3 miles away. We no longer tend to the land. We have 5 cows and some chickens." "That's a very lonely life," Goade murmured with an involuntary shiver. "It doesn't feel that way to us at all," Annabelle said stiffly. Goade, setting his napkin on the table, turned his chair toward the two women. Flip, with a small gurgle of satisfaction, leaped onto his lap. "Where do you get your supplies?" he asked. "A carrier from Exford visits us every Saturday," Mathilda told him. "Our needs are simple." The large room, singularly devoid of furniture as Goade noted while looking around, was full of dark corners that the single oil lamp did not reach. The two women were barely visible. However, from time to time, in the flickering firelight, he could see them more clearly. He estimated they were between 40 and 50 years old, so strikingly similar that they could well be twins. He found himself speculating about their history. They must have been very beautiful once. "I wonder," he asked after a somewhat prolonged pause, "if I might impose on your hospitality a little further and ask for a sofa or a bed to spend the night. Any place will do," he added quickly. Mathilda immediately stood up, took another candle from the mantelpiece, and lit it. "I will show you where you can sleep," she said. Goade was puzzled for a moment. He had looked at Annabelle and was surprised to see a sudden expression of curiosity, almost malice, on her face. He leaned in to see her better in the dim glow of the lamp, but the expression, if it had ever been there, had vanished. She simply looked at him patiently, with something in her face that he could not quite understand. "Follow me, please," Mathilda invited. Goade stood up. Flip turned and let out one last defiant bark at the enormous shepherd dog, which had settled at a distance from the fire. When he received no satisfying response, he trotted after his master. They entered a well-designed but almost empty hallway, climbed a wide oak staircase, and reached the first landing. Outside the room where Goade had seen the candlelight, he paused for a moment and listened. "Do you have any other guests?" he asked. "Annabelle has a visitor," she replied. "Follow me, please." She led him to a bedroom, which contained little more than an enormous four-poster bed. She placed the candle on a table and pulled back a kind of quilt covering the sheets. She touched them and nodded in approval. Goade unconsciously found himself following her example. To his surprise, they were warm. She pointed to a large brass bed warmer with a long handle on the other side of the room, from which wisps of smoke still rose. "Were you expecting someone tonight?" he asked curiously. "We are always prepared," Mathilda responded. She left the room, apparently forgetting to wish him good night. He called out to her gently, but she did not answer. He heard her quiet steps descending the stairs. Then, silence returned. Silence downstairs and silence in the part of the house where he was. Flip, sniffing around the room, occasionally showed signs of excitement, sometimes growling. Goade opened the window and ventured to smoke a cigarette. "No wonder you're growling, Flip," he said. "This is a strange place." Outside, nothing could be seen, and little could be heard, except for the roar of rushing water nearby and the patter of rain. Suddenly, he remembered his suitcase. Leaving his door ajar, he went downstairs. In the large stone kitchen, the two women sat exactly as they had before his arrival and during dinner. Both looked at him, but neither spoke. "If you don't mind," Goade explained, "I want to fetch my suitcase from the car." Mathilda nodded. He stepped into the darkness, stumbled toward the shed, and opened the car's trunk to retrieve his suitcase. Just as he was about to leave, he reconsidered, reopened the car, and searched the toolbox for a flashlight. He slipped it into his pocket and stepped out of the shed. When he re-entered the house, the two women were still seated, silent. "It's a dreadful night," he commented. "I can't express how grateful I am for this shelter." They looked at him, but neither replied. This time, when he reached his room, he shut the door firmly. He frowned in disappointment upon realizing that, apart from the latch, there was no way to lock it. Then, he chuckled quietly to himself. He, the brave police officer, the victor of a dozen fights against dangerous and desperate men, was suddenly nervous in this remote farmhouse inhabited by two unfamiliar women. "Well, better get some sleep," he murmured to himself. "There's really no reason to be uneasy, right, Flip?" he added as he lifted the quilt. Flip opened one eye and growled. Goade was puzzled. "Still, there's something about this place I don't like," he reflected. "I wonder who's in that room with the candles." He softly opened his door and listened. The silence was almost absolute. From downstairs in the large kitchen, he could hear the ticking of a clock and see the thin line of yellow light beneath the door. Crossing the landing, he listened for a moment, pressing his ear against the door of the candlelit room. Inside, there was utter silence, not even the sound of normal breathing from a sleeping person. He stepped back, shut his door, and began to undress. At the bottom of his suitcase was a small automatic pistol. His fingers played with it for a moment before tossing it back inside. The flashlight, however, he placed beside his bed. Before lying down, he leaned once more toward the window. The roar of the rushing water seemed louder than ever. Otherwise, there was no sound. The rain had stopped, but the sky was black and starless. Shivering slightly, he got into bed. He had no idea what time it was, but the darkness outside was still just as deep when Flip's growl suddenly woke him. The dog had freed himself from the quilt at the foot of the bed, and Goade could see his eyes, small points of light gleaming in the dark. He remained still for a moment, listening. From the first instant, he knew someone was in the room. His instincts told him so, though he could detect no sound. Slowly, his hand moved toward the side of the bed. He grabbed the flashlight and switched it on. Standing beside the bed was Mathilda, still fully dressed. In her hand, extended toward him, was the most menacing knife he had ever seen. Swiftly, Goade jumped out of bed, keeping the flashlight's beam fixed on the woman. "What do you want?" he asked, surprised at the unsteadiness in his own voice. What the hell are you doing with that knife? I don't want you to leave again, William, she replied, with a note of disappointment in her tone. Why did you leave? Goade lit the candle. The hand that had so firmly gripped his pistol against a dangerous murderer now trembled. However, as the light filled the room, he felt more in control. Drop that knife on the bed, he ordered, and tell me what you were planning to do with it. She obeyed immediately and leaned slightly toward him. I was going to kill you, William, she admitted. And why? Goade asked. She shook her head sadly. Because it's the only way, Mathilda answered. For starters, my name isn't William, he objected. And what do you mean by the only way? She smiled, a sad, incredulous smile. You shouldn't deny your name, she said. You are William Falsham. I recognized you immediately, even after all these years. He arrived, she added, motioning toward the other room. And Annabelle thought he was William. I let her keep him. I knew that if I waited, you would come. Leaving aside the matter of my identity, Goade said with effort, why did you want to kill me? What do you mean by the only way? It's the only way to keep the man we love, she answered. Annabelle and I realized that when William left us. We sat here and waited for him to return. We never spoke of it, but we both knew. You mean you were going to kill me to keep me here? He pressed. She looked at the knife fondly. That's not killing, she said. Death wouldn't come until later, and you would never be able to leave. You would be here forever. Goade began to understand, and a horrible thought crept into his mind. And what about the man Annabelle thought was William? He asked. You can see him if you want, she replied eagerly. You'll see how peaceful and happy he is. Maybe then you'll regret waking up. Come with me. He grabbed the knife and followed her out of the room, across the landing. Under the door he could see a small sliver of light, the same light that had illuminated that room, guiding him to the house. Mathilda opened the door softly and held the candle above her head. Lying on a massive four-poster bed was the body of a young man. His face was as pale as the sheet, and Goade knew at first glance that he was dead. Beside him, sitting rigidly in a high-backed chair, was Annabelle. She raised a finger and frowned as they entered. She looked at Goade. Walk carefully, she whispered. William is sleeping. As the first light of dawn filtered through the clouds, Goade staggered into the village of Nid, followed by his dog, Flip. He went door to door until he breathed a sigh of relief at the sight of a bronze plaque on one of them. He rang the bell forcefully. A window suddenly opened and a man's head appeared. What's the matter? He called out. Goade looked up. I spent part of the night at a farmhouse a few miles from here, he explained hastily. There's a dead man there, and my car is broken down. A dead man? The doctor repeated. I saw him. My car broke down on the road. Otherwise, I would have been here sooner. I'll be with you in 5 minutes, the doctor promised, then quickly disappeared inside, shutting the window. He kept his word. Moments later, they were seated in the doctor's car, heading back to the farmhouse. He listened to Goade's story and nodded sympathetically. If I've reconstructed this correctly, he remarked, you had a very narrow escape. It had stopped raining, and daylight had fully arrived. Soon they pulled up in front of the house. There was no response when they knocked. The doctor turned the doorknob and pushed it open. They entered the kitchen. The fire had gone out, but Mathilda and Annabelle sat in their high-backed chairs, facing each other in silence, their eyes wide open. They both turned their heads as the men entered. Annabelle slowly nodded with satisfaction. It's the doctor, she said. Doctor, I'm so glad you've come. You know that William has returned. He came for me. He's lying upstairs, but I can't wake him. I sit by his side, holding his hand, speaking to him, but he says nothing. He sleeps so deeply. Could you wake him, please? I'll show you where he is. She left the room, and the doctor followed. Mathilda listened to their steps, then turned to Goade with a strange smile on her lips. "Annabelle and I don't speak," she explained. "We haven't spoken for so many years, I've lost count. But I wish someone would tell her that the man lying upstairs is not William. I wish someone would tell her that you are William and that you've come back for me. Sit down, William. Once the doctor has gone, I'll light the fire and make you some tea." Goade sat down, once again feeling his hands tremble. The woman looked at him tenderly. "You've been away a long time," she continued, "but I would have recognized you anywhere. It's strange that Annabelle doesn't recognize you. Sometimes I think we've lived alone here for so long that maybe she has lost her memory. I'm glad you brought the doctor, William. Annabelle will now realize her mistake." The sound of footsteps descending the stairs echoed through the house. The doctor entered, took Goade by the arm, and led him aside. "You were absolutely right," he said gravely. "The man upstairs is dead. I believe he has been dead for at least 4 days. One of us must stay here while the other goes to the police station." Goade nervously adjusted his hat. "I'll go to the station," he declared. "That's actually my job. I'm a police inspector." Goade took the doctor's car and drove back to Niad. At the station, he identified himself and reported everything that had happened. Later, he learned that the dead man was a transporter from Exford who had been missing since the previous Saturday. The local police took over the case, and after repairing his car, Goade resumed his journey. His vacation could not have started in a worse way. The whole dreadful affair had shaken him deeply. Even Flip remained silent, curled up in a corner of the car. "I hope the rest of my vacation is peaceful and uneventful," Goade muttered to himself. "One thing is certain. I will never again seek shelter in a lonely farmhouse." The end. And that's the end of this fascinating story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did sharing it with you. If you liked it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.